Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session about national romantic painting in the Nordic countries in the late 19th century. And I am aware that the abstract in the program, by mistake, is only talking about Sweden, but that is no fault of the other panel members. We're going to give 4 short presentations, and then we'll have a discussion on this topic. I'm very happy to welcome here the members of the panel. First to speak will be Peter Nørgaard Larsen from the Statens Museum for Kunst, National Gallery of Denmark in Copenhagen. Then we will have Nicholas Parkinson from the Pratt Institute in New York, and maybe you have another affiliation that you want to mention when you go on. And then Rita Ojanperä from the Finnish National Gallery in Helsinki will speak, and then I will round it up. I'm Martin Olin from the National Museum in Stockholm. So we can't really move this computer, so I think you'll have to ask me to change the images. This is that yours? Is that the right mode then? Okay. Is there something? Yeah. Good. So, Peter, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Martin. Yes, I have prepared a short presentation on national romanticism in Denmark in the decades around 1850. Because compared to the other Nordic countries, where national romanticism is very strong in the decades around 1900, it peaks almost 50 years before in Denmark. In the late Golden Age era, as we call it, from 1850 to 1864, from the First Schleswig War to the traumatic defeat in the war against Prussia, art and especially painting played a significant role in creating or constructing Danish national identity. And seen from a national perspective, the first part of 19th century has become highlighted and firmly established as the period where Denmark became Denmark, where much of the basis of Denmark's national sentiments and the Danish self-image were constructed. The National Liberal Party was ruling Denmark in the decades around 1850, and they used art as a vehicle to promote a certain image of Denmark as a nation. The leading figure was national... Is there another one? Could you change the picture? Yeah. Okay, yeah, great. The leading figure was the guy on the left, Niels Laurits Højen, an art historian who was both a critic, a curator. He was a teacher at the academy. He was extremely influential and powerful. And in 1844, he formulated the guidelines for the national romantic movement. Do we still have a picture?
No. Something is wrong.
Have you activated the DS show down there?
Okay, I'll just call the technician.
We'll do it the...
We'll just pause a little bit. But I can perhaps continue with presenting Mr. Højen to you, hoping for some other slides to pop up. But he was extremely influential in the years around 1850, and he formulated these guidelines for the national romantic movement. The artists were called upon to focus on 3 main themes in the service of the new art. They should paint historic churches and buildings. Secondly, they should go out and paint the peasantry. Not, however, hardworking peasants laboring in their work clothes, but peasants dressed in their finery as symbols of an original soul of the people, shared tribal features. And thirdly, they should, of course, go out and paint Danish landscapes, but not just the local landscape around Copenhagen. Rather, artists should ideally venture out into the realm, away from the noisy cities and their familiar subjects, and paint landscapes from remote part of the country, for instance, in Jutland or the Isle of Fyn. But these national sentiments in art was not invented by Høyen. They were already there. Historic churches and buildings were a common feature among the Golden Age artists long before Høyen formulated his guidelines. I don't know if you can see anything. No. What is on the slide? Okay, that is a national building. But I would have loved to show you a painting by Jørgen Rod of the cathedral in Roskilde, perhaps it comes on later. But it's fine with Købke, if you can stay there just a second. This one shows, as you can see, the Frederiksborg Castle from 1835. And the next one, if you can find that one. This one.
It doesn't appear on the screen.
It's still the castle, okay. But there were also artists painting landscapes from Jutland before 1844. So Høyen's guidelines presented in a lecture in 1844 has traditionally been regarded as a programmatic injunction for Danish artists. But there's much to suggest that the artists were already well underway in the treatment of such themes by 1844. They have actually begun already back in the 1830s. This would indicate that the artists joined Høyen in paving the way for new subject matters, and that Høyen simply collated these mutually shared ideas in his lectures. Thus, the role of the artist can be ascribed far greater importance than earlier has been the case. And now I need a slide of some paintings by Købke.
Yeah, I think you should take just a brief moment and we'll continue.
Mm-hmm. Looks better.
So do you want to comment on this image?
No, it's just go on and take the Købke there to the right. Yeah, that's the one. Yeah, because this is one of the most significant examples of an artist expressing his commitment to the growing national awareness and sentiment. It's Købke's iconic landscape from 1838, where he's flying the Danish flag, the Dannebrog, to the right in the bottom. Købke's painting is idealized to the point of the saccharine, showing two women on a small jetty with the Danish flag unfurling from the flagpole. This really Danish Golden Age stuff, sweet, idyllic, and entirely without political undercurrents, or so many would assume, but we should be very wary of making these assumptions about the Golden Age artists. It is very likely that the paintings reflects the same issue we outlined above. So should these works be seen as accurate reflection of reality or as a vision of Denmark as it ought to be? So present-day Danish observers, the Danish flag may well be most widespread symbol of the nation, but it is also a symbol of celebration closely associated with birthdays and other festive family occasions. Today the flag combines many roles as a popular marker of celebrations, as a signifier of national pride in connection with sports and games, and as a symbol of the nation in official context. In Købke's day, the flag was none of these things. It was exclusively the flag of the king and the navy. And after 1842, it was also the flag of the military forces. Flying the flag privately was officially prohibited by the king's orders. But from the late 1830s, the ban was not slightly or strictly enforced as before. So why did Købke include a flag in his painting? Did he actually see it on the jetty? Or did he paint a wistful scene, a depiction of what he would like Denmark to look like? I'm quite sure the latter is the most likely scenario. The studies and sketches, as you see here, contains no flag. There is then much to suggest that Købke very deliberately wanted to insert a flag in his final official painting. But to what end? The flag might signify faithful support to the monarchy, but it might also be a sign of sympathy with the new movements and national sentiments. The national liberal movement sought to forge closer links between the Danish flag and the Danish language, history, country, people, thereby creating a sense of community by wielding the flag as a symbol. Certain aspects of the painting suggest that Købke felt a kinship with this patriotic camp, particularly the fact that it showed figures belonging to perhaps the common people. But regardless of Købke's political sympathies, the flag is such a prominent feature that it would hardly have been added without careful consideration. This further suggests that the scene is a deliberately staged vision rather than an example of objective everyday realism. Many Golden Age paintings inscribed themselves in this narrative. They were more than just realistic portrayals of everyday life. Behind the surface, revolution and social indignation seethed and bubbled, and the aesthetically pleasing paintings served to express different views on politics and social issues. They were, in brief, the election posters of the area. And even more poster-like, this painting by Jørgen Sonnes, Rural Scene, which combines all the significant symbols of Danish identity. The peasantry dressed in the colors of the Danish flag, carrying themselves almost like Greek statues, with a view to a summer landscape with a rife cornfield stalks in the air and ancient burial moments. And to the far left, if you can see it, there's a glimpse of a Danish fjord. Here, national romanticism is shown in full scale, and the artists show his commitment to the national cause. In 1864, war broke out. Again, the so-called Second Schleswig War. Seen from a Danish perspective, the outcome was disastrous. Denmark lost the duchies, which meant that the kingdom yet again lost territory, trade, and source of income. Denmark had become nothing more than a small nation-state with a constitutional government that had not yet brought about true democratic rule. The national liberal project suffered a decisive setback, causing it to peter out as a political movement. The world of art also changed as a result of these tumultuous events after 1864. Many artists gave up depicting idealized peasants, historic churches, ancient relics in landscapes, etc. And most artists turned their back on the national liberals. In the decades that followed, Danish artists struggled and strove to yet again redefine Danish history via art. And if there is time after the presentations, I think we can discuss what happened in Denmark after 1864, because of course national identities were still expressed, but in a much more modest way, in a subdued manner that perhaps differs very much from what is going on in the rest of the Nordic countries. Yeah, but will you go on?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Be here. Thank you very much. All right. So then do we have to put it onto the slideshow? I believe. Yeah. And that was here. It's visible, right? Fantastic. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Nicholas Parkinson. Currently, I'm in New York. I'm a professor at the Pratt Institute. However, in September, I'll be a postdoctoral fellow at the New Carlsberg Glyptotek in Copenhagen, which explains a little bit more my presence here at a Nordic panel. So anyways, thank you everyone, especially to my panel members and to the organizers. So the title of my presentation is Strange Bedfellows. Hold on just a second while I get my timer out. And okay, so first off, actually this is in something that I wanted to notice is this title, Strange Bedfellows. Maybe this doesn't so easily translate into other languages. It's actually Shakespeare. It's from The Tempest. It's when Trinculo meets a strange chimera Caliban during a storm. He gets under his coat, this monster, and he says, "Misery acquaints a man with strange bedfellows." But one of my friends had said, you know, maybe people won't actually understand what this phrase means, strange bedfellows, right? If you're not somebody that speaks English when you grow up, maybe you haven't heard it before. Interestingly enough, in 1865, Victor Hugo's son, François Victor Hugo, translated it as "le malheur donne à un homme d'étranges compagnons de lit." I don't know if it really has the same effect, but nonetheless, what it means is that when times are hard, people mingle with those that they normally wouldn't, which is really right on to what I'm going to be talking about, which is people that intermingle with people that they normally wouldn't across history, and also talking about how groups form broadly. So really what I'm going to be doing is talking about how we talk about Nordic art in general, or that is, I should say, how Nordic art was talked about basically from the 1860s to the 1890s, leading up to National Romanticism in France. So I'm going to do a little bit of a reception history of Nordic art in France, largely through the perspective of art criticism. So then, you know, how do we talk about the artists of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland? Do we link them together? Is there a Nordic art? Well, within France, this is a complicated issue. So at the beginning of the 20th century, let's advance one slide, we can see it in French art historical literature, during the time of National Romanticism, at the fin du siècle, there was definitely an idea of Nordic art, except it wasn't called la nordique, or Nordic art, it was la Scandinave, les écoles Scandinaves, l'école Scandinave. We even see that within the organization of something like the Musée Luxembourg, right, where we have les écoles Scandinaves, where we have a lot of people that we would associate with National Romanticism, like P.S. Krøyer, Niels Kreuger, Erik Wernschol, Albert Edelfelt. However, I'm going to argue by the end of this presentation that politics, and in particular the Franco-Prussian War, was a major factor in bringing about this organization, the idea that there's something called la Scandinave, or les écoles Scandinaves. So, next slide, please. So, at the end of the 19th century, we oftentimes see within the writings of French critics this profoundly strong attraction towards so-called Scandinavian art. And it's a major theme of interest, you know, for Scandinavian art, literature, music. Yet, at the same time, many art critics thought of Scandinavian art as, well, French. So let me explain. So at the 1889 Universal Exposition in Paris, which was a major point of success for Nordic artists in general, one critic, Charles Poncenaille, writes in his article, Les Artistes Scandinaves, "If I rank Scandinavia at the top, this is because at heart I hope to flatter France. Scandinavian art advances resolutely by our side, like an auxiliary army, an elite corps, and perhaps, with a bold audacity, surpasses us. We owe them the conquest." So it's a curious quote, filled with praise, unabashed self-praise, military allusions, which we'll get back to in a bit. But how do we arrive here, to this idea that there's something like Scandinavian art and that it's, well, somehow attached to France within the sort of French milieu of art criticism and writing? Well, this wasn't always the case that this was the manner of organization. Could we advance one slide? So, it's not that Nordic artists were particularly new to art critics in 1889. In fact, they were immensely popular in the 1850s and the 1860s. So during the Second Empire, artists like Adolf Tiedemann, along with Hans Gude, were two of the most well-known Norwegian artists in France, and in general, Nordic artists in France. So here we see just a few of their biggest hits, if you will. So at the first Paris Universal Exposition in 1855, sorry, Adolf Tiedemann, his Funérailles dans les campagnes de Norvège was an outstanding success, which earned the artist both his first-class medal, as well as the rank of Chevalier in the Légion d'honneur. 6 years later, at the Salon of 1861, his painting La Toilette de la Fiancée en Norvège was purchased by the French state for 12,000 francs. And at the same salon, Tiedemann's colleague, Hans Gude, had a big success when the Emperor Napoleon III himself purchased his painting, Les Montagnes de Norvège, for 6,000 francs. The landscape was sent to the Emperor's palace at Saint-Cloud, where it was hung up at the Salon des Dames, seen in this painting here, although sadly it's the only image that we have of it since it was burned in a palace fire. So the point is, both Gude and Tiedemann and others were, in fact, very well known in France, and in a sense, helping define what Norwegian, or more broadly Nordic art, if you will, looked like to French audiences. And yet they were largely known as, well, German, if we could advance this slide. So German art was seen as having the qualities of being sad, elegiac, profound, and this is what French critics also thought of Scandinavian art, especially given the funerary scenes of certain people like Tiedemann. So, moreover, German art was popular, and so was Scandinavian art at the time, and so they were linked together. So, let's advance one more slide. So, we see this again within the Dictionnaire historique des peintres de toutes les écoles by the Wallonian art historian Alfred Sera. And in it, under l'école allemande, we see Dusseldorf artists like Johann Christian Dahl, Hans Gude, which sort of makes sense because they actually trained within Germany. But then even more curiously, we see under the idea of the German school, the Danish Golden Age artist C.W. Egesberg. We also see the Swedish Rococo painter Gustav Lundberg. And this is where things get particularly sticky. So let's advance one more slide. In the same dictionary, Sera places a smaller group of Nordic artists under the so-called École Française. And under that, we see 18th century portraitists like Rosselin, who, of course, worked in France quite prolifically. We also see some 19th century Nordic artists like Johan Gorbitz, Carl Fredrik Sjörbue. But then we also see this term suédois, or that is to say a category, suédois, the Swedes. It's composed of a much smaller group of about 15 to 20 artists, and it lacks the moniker école. So that is to say, it's an ambiguous group. It's a group without a school. It's a group without a master, without a succinct or classifiable style. And in that, we see people like Johan Höckert, Per Wickenberg, two famous Swedish artists who had worked in France, but also, most strangely, the Norwegian artist Adolf Tiedemann. So the point is that it's largely seen as German, that is to say Nordic artists, yet at the same time, it's very hard to classify because it's not exactly a real science by any means. So then how does it all suddenly become French? Well, if we could advance one more slide. This has to do with the backlash against German art after the Franco-Prussian War. And so suddenly, German art, which was fashionable during the Second Empire, isn't so fashionable anymore because of geopolitical conflict. And, well, Nordic art, or Nordic artists, I should say, suffer from that. And we see this very clearly just 2 years after the end of the Franco-Prussian War in the 1873 Vienna Universal Exposition. And there, the French art critic, René Menard, who is very important for the development of things like the art history textbook within France, he visits the Nordic salons and he writes, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark occupy the same room in the same exhibition, but if the name of each nationality was not written above the doors, one would think that the room was an annex of Germany. Let's advance one more slide. So the critic continues, these idlers make one think of the provincials who strut about in last year's fashions. When quitting the foreign for the French section, it is as though one enters the capital after having wandered through the suburbs. It is here that everyone comes to take their cues, and today Paris is the center of the life and activity of the arts. So in other words, Nordic artists suddenly found themselves out of fashion due to the contrivances of French art historical taxonomies, which had largely seen them as German before the Third Republic, and this largely positive label now suddenly becomes less fashionable after the war. However, as we already know from the beginning of my talk, this doesn't just stay the same. So, to go on to my final slide, my final point, that same year when René Menard is giving his sort of rather chauvinistic critique of Germany and of the Scandinavian artists, how they seem provincial, we have somebody else writing. And that's these two writers, well, Jules Claretie, who's a critic and sort of a poet, and then there's Jules Delaunay, who's an academic French painter. They write a little booklet called L'Art Scandinave, Scandinavian Art. And in it, they praise artists like Lawrence Fröhlich, the Swedish King Charles XV, who had in fact exhibited at the Universal Exposition of 1867. He himself was a painter, and people like Christine de Post and many others. And in it, he has a very different sentiment. He writes, "These people of the North, of whom we love their honesty, calm reason, fidelity, and profound humor, have amongst themselves a true art, a special art, that one could call a Scandinavian art. And this book should have the following dedication: France towards the countries of the North." And so this is significant not only because it's so different from now it's sort of anti-Germanist, xenophobic perspective, but not only because it's one of the first times in French literature that we actually see the term l'art scandinave appear, the idea of a succinct Scandinavian style, but also because it represents a major ideological shift. And as Claretie's point seems, or his quote seems to hint at, it's not really so much that Nordic art has changed. It's not just the oncoming of a new generation of artists that brings about the idea of Scandinavian art, if you will. But rather, it's this idea that France has suddenly shifted its ideology. So in the wake of the Franco-Prussian War, and in the backdrop of this sort of outlash of xenophobia, right, there's also this surge towards cosmopolitanism. It's undoubtedly a kind of self-serving cosmopolitanism, one that even verges upon, quite oftenly and quite literally, sometimes cultural colonialism, as we had seen with Ponsonai's quote. But now it suddenly shifts Nordic artists, right, the artists of Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, towards a sort of Scandinavian ideal, towards the idea that Scandinavia is now going to be an ally of France, rather than, say, an ally of Germany. And by sort of repositioning the idea of sort of the categories of art after the geopolitical fallout and sort of changes of the Franco-Prussian War, now suddenly we see art historical categories changing as well. So we can talk about that more, maybe during the questions and the answers. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think we can go to the next slide, please. And yes, I'm Rita Jämper from the Finnish National Gallery, and I'm going to take up some remarks on the topic national romantic art and also painting from the perspective of the Finnish narrative. And yes, talking about national romantic art, it is about narratives. And in a way, I could start with sort of repeating what Peter Norgård Larsson already said. We are talking about an idea of a golden age. We are talking about a country, in this case Finland, becoming Finland in a way of creating an identity, a cultural identity, and the creation of a national image. And what is interesting about these narratives, they tend to express themselves as something very unique, something very original. But in fact, the structure, the idea of these narratives of becoming something like having a national identity, they very often resemble each other a lot. But there are differences too. Well, in fact, one resemblance with what Peter and Nicholas were saying was that you were both starting with the talk with referring to a war. And I'm here referring to a war too. The war which happened between Sweden and Russia, and ended up in 1809 as Finland becoming not part of Sweden, but as an autonomous Grand Duchy of Russia. And this is crucial when talking about what happened then in the context of creating a national identity. What is very important here too is the idea and the role of the language, the national language. Because despite of being a Grand Duchy of Russia, Finland could keep the former official language, Swedish, as its official language, so also as the language of culture. But the Finnish people, the inhabitants of most of the territory of Finland, were talking Finnish. And this is something which also goes with the general question of Scandinavianism, the idea of Scandinavian art in relation to the idea which was created in Finland in the context of creating a specifically Finnish art. So the idea or conception of Finnishness, whatever it is or whatever it has been, is something very important here. So next slide, please. I'm referring here to the Finnish national anthem, which is based on a poem from 1846 by Johan Ludvig Runeberg. Because I have underlined some lines there, which sort of, in a way, base some general ideas of a specifically Finnish identity, something about the idea of Finnishness. Our land is poor, and so shall be. About nature, the whisper of dark woods at night, our starry skies, our summer light, and the wars which had been spreading on the Finnish territory between Sweden and Russia many times during the history of the territory. So, with sword and plough and thought, our fathers fought. And also then referring to the tale, the sort of creation of identity on this warry history. Next slide, please. So, talking about Finnish language and the national romantic ideology and what happened actually in Finland, I'm taking up sort of two subjects from the history of Finnish painting, the Kalevala and landscape, which the landscape is something which combines the Finnish art history very much to other Scandinavian countries' art histories, but the Kalevala is not, it is most specifically Finnish. And so it is about an epos considered as national epos, which is based on oral folklore, which was collected actively during the first part of the 19th century and then published in a literal form, first in 1835 and then in 1849. And this is considered as the beginnings of Finnish language as a cultural language. Next slide, please. But it also has to do with, because I was starting with geography, so it has to do with an idea of where the idea of original Finnishness was looked for. So when we're talking about the Kalevala, so it was not the West, the original source of Western culture in Finland, but it was in the East, not as part of Russian culture, but as part of a Finno-Ugrian culture, which was alive in the regions of Karelia, in eastern Finland, and partly in the territory which was and has always been part of Russia. Next slide, please. But then talking about visual art and painting, so the Finnish authorities, after the publishing of Kalevala Epos, very much persuaded Finnish visual artists to take up these motifs and paint them. So this is what happens. So at the same time, when Finnish art culture was being created and Finnish artists were sort of also sent and expected to study abroad, because in Finland there were no great possibilities to achieve the best formation in visual arts. So at the same time, they were expected to take up especially Finnish motifs. And Kalevala was one of these. And the first flux was already very soon after Kalevala was published. Next slide, please. And then sort of we end up in the very climax of the idea of national romanticism in Finland and in Finnish painting and art during 1880s and 1890s. And one of the most well-known names here is Akseli Gallen-Kallela, who again not only took up the Kalevala motifs, he was painting peasants like the Golden Age Danish colleagues earlier, and of course Finnish landscapes, but also the Kalevala, which has been considered as something sort of the climax of creation of especially Finnish art and painting. Talking about the interpretations of what happened is interesting too, because it is about a narrative. Next slide, please. So I took here a citation from Onni Okkonen, who wrote the first biography of Gallen-Kallela. And here in the last chapter of the quotation, he's writing in 1835. The cursing Kullervo, who is one of the characters from the national epic, so-called national epic Kalevala, Kullervo is a symbol of his Finnish race. He's terrible, he's caring and sublime in the sense of Renaissance aesthetic. So, in a way, these characters, and also in this case, his sort of wary and violent, you could say aggressive expression is interpreted as the essence of the Finnish, well, he's saying race, but let's say people. Next slide, please. I'm not going more to this, but this is sort of politically coming very much up then during the time of the Paris World Fair 1900, where Gallen-Kallela painted in the Finnish pavilion these same motifs in the interior of the pavilion. But just to end with a couple of slides of Finnish landscapes, who at the same time, at the middle of the 19th century, the idea of Finnishness was also underlined with landscape painting. So here we see something which maybe many of you recognize as, in a way, idiomatic idea of what Finland is. You can see the same type of images in tourist brochures today. So the Finland is, well, it's about lakes. Not all of Finland is full of lakes, but the Lake District was sort of the core of what Finland and Finnishness was. Next slide, please. So this idea was in fact created by artists, and it was then repeated during the very late 19th century. by artists of the same generation as Akseli Gallen-Kallela. And the last slide, please. I end with this idea of wild nature being the core of Finnish national romantic identity. Thank you.
No, I thought I'd start with this slide, which to a Swedish art historian is recognizable as a rather typical example of a national romantic painting. It's not an exact portrait of a place. It's probably based, though, in the way two farms may have looked in the west of Sweden. Here is probably close to where the artist Carl Nordström grew up. However, it's not perhaps for non-Swedes immediately recognizable as a very Swedish landscape. It's very flat. It's by the sea. It's not perhaps what you imagine the high north to be like. And this is a question I will return to at the end of my talk, because in the 1890s, a group of artists around Carl Nordström and his friend Richard Berg struggled with how to relieve themselves somehow of what they had learnt in France and to be less French, to be not be less good, but to be more Swedish in a way. And Barry in particular is very interesting because he's very alert and writes about this, so you can follow his trains of thought. He acquired in 1892 the Gauguin landscape that we see on the screen now in the museum in Stockholm, but behind also in Barry's home here behind his wife in a portrait from 1895. It should be 1895, not 1985 there in the text. And the sort of synthetist landscapes of the 1880s and 90s were important, but they were felt, I think, impossibly radical for the task that Barry wanted to set himself to sort of interpret the Swedish landscape. But the idea of sort of not being too detailed, not too particular about the way he painted, and concentrate on the sort of the larger lines, the decorative aspects, but in particular the feel of it, the sense. The Stimmung is a German word, but it has got an exact Swedish translation, which was used more and perhaps is not the exact atmosphere, but also sort of almost as kind of literary contents. The dusk, the sort of late, the night light, the low light of the summer, became the preferred time of day to paint. No more sort of French daylight scenes of the 1880s. Barry had a long-standing admiration for Böcklin, as we can see in his sort of interpretation of the famous Toteninsel here to the right, but set very recognizably to a Swede in Visby on Gotland with the medieval wall of the city in the background. But when he had painted this painting, he felt sick of Böcklin and said, I don't want more Böcklin. I think it's too decadent and too German, and I want to be doing something else. So in the 1890s, they were thinking about this. But my argument here is a little bit that to us, what they came up with was something that was much imitated has become really, for Swedes, what we associate with Swedishness in art. But I think for an audience, and the further you go away from Sweden to the south, it doesn't appear particularly Nordic or particularly recognizable. It's a painting of the period, as it were. Another painter who actually went to the far north, to the Lofoten Islands in the north of Norway, was Anna Boberg. And for between 1901, I think, and the early 1930s, she returned every year and painted spectacular scenes of these high mountains in the sea. She focused on the light effects of the summer nights and of the northern light of the aurora borealis. And she exhibited in France, where she was helped by a family friend, Sarah Bernard, who promoted her and asked people to come and see her shows. And they were acquired by not only collectors, but by national galleries in France and in Italy. She painted here as she called them, the modern Vikings, the fishermen who went out to sea, and the lives of these, hard lives of the fishermen in the Lofoten Islands. Here is a picture of Anna Boberg in her studio and a sort of spectacular painting of the aurora borealis, which is now in the museum in Stockholm. She actually represented Sweden in the Venice Biennale several times, and in 1912 on her own as the only exhibiting artist. The background to this is that her husband, the architect Ferdinand Boberg, was the architect of the pavilion, and that Anders Zorn, who had been asked to curate it, was sort of away in America, didn't answer letters and so on. But so it was, it has an historical context. But what I'm saying is that her art had a sort of international success because I think it was sort of looked like, you would imagine a Nordic art to look like from a far point of observation far away, and the critics in Sweden, and in particular Nordström, the painter of the two farms in the beginning, hated her painting and said it's not at all good. He wrote her down really fiercely in Swedish journals, and up to a point, she was a self-taught painter. She's not a particularly skilled painter, but they said a friend of her, Prince Eugen, told her, when she confronted him and said, what is it you dislike with my art? He said that it's too much just what the mountains look like. There is no feeling in it. You don't convey the feeling of the place. And this was a theory of Richard Berg's, and I'm ending with this picture, which I'll sort of talk a little bit more about. Berg articulated these in sort of long essays where he talked about the art of landscape painting, and he said that I think that it's impossible for a painter who has not grown up in a place, who hasn't got the landscape in his bones, cannot convey it in an efficient way in a landscape painting. It doesn't look real. It's sort of fake. And then this is a sort of theory for the idea that the painters then in the 1890s went back to not only to Sweden, but to the places where they had grown up or had a sort of family bonds, and painted those parts of the landscape. This relates, I think, closely to Rita's paper also. But it is a little strange to read. They went to Italy and they had this painting, which is one of Berg's most famous paintings. It was actually conceived in Italy, where the girl who was a singer was the model for the woman to the left, modeled for Berg, but in that occasion, Berg wrote and said, I look at these beautiful Italian Florentine pine trees. They're nothing to me. I dream of the sort of simple Swedish pine trees back at home. They're simple, and he's using this as a metaphor in a way also for the sort of idea that the Nordic art can be as good as foreign art, but it's sort of stripped of the sophistication, and it's more genuine, it's more real, it has a an essentialness that you don't find in French art because it's too sophisticated, in a very simplified argument. And this became also a sort of model for interpretation of historic art in this period. So the sort of 18th century Swedish art was conceived as, you know, of course less sophisticated than art in Paris, but also in a sort of proto-modernist, in the sense that it was more, it hadn't discarded some of the sort of too silly ornaments. It was sort of down to the structure, to proportions, to the sort of essential beauty. And I think this was a way they looked at the landscapes as well. This painting, for me, looks, you know, it's. I would say this is Sweden to me, in a sense. In 1992, Michel Farkas, an American art historian, wrote an article saying how this painting had been so differently interpreted when it toured the United States in a 1980s exhibition called Nordic Light, where it was the sort of poster picture of it. And sophisticated American critics didn't associate it to the sort of contemplation of nature, but to the figures, thinking of Strindberg, saying these are two people from a Strindberg place, they're man and wife, she has cheated on him and they have quarreled violently and it's about sex, and they were looking for sort of phallic symbolism in it, and it was sort of obvious to them that it must be about what they knew of Swedish culture. That is, they knew of Strindberg and they knew of Ingmar Bergman and that sort of intensity. And this brings me back to a little bit of a sort of meta-reflection, that when we in the committee discussed what topics we should address in this festival, some of us in the room were present at that discussion. It was a little bit of sort of a compromise between what do people actually know about Scandinavia nowadays. So it's a crimi noir, this crimi noir, Scandi noir, we can talk about that. The Vikings. Well, we don't particularly go around thinking about the Vikings. We think more about sunsets and so I thought this would open perhaps a discussion about how can we've heard talks here about the sort of the context of national romanticism, but also about the reception in Nick's interesting paper, how it looks from far away. And I think it is a sort of a kind of ghost, like nationalism. Sort of national romanticism in art is also a kind of ghost. You can sort of know what it is, but you can never put your hand on it. Thank you. So I'd like to open up the discussion here, and I thought I'd ask Peter because you started off with Köpke in the 1830s and 40s and so on, but what happened in the later 19th century in Denmark? Because we had a little talk last night about how the peasant class in all other Scandinavian countries is the sort of, what the painter would put in as a symbol of a man of the people. But in Denmark, the sort of bourgeois associations of the Danish Golden Age painters is something which is sort of quite different. Could you comment on that? What happens to that identity in the later 19th century?
What happens is that we lose this war in 1864, the Prussian War, and it has had a great impact on Danish mentality, Danish culture. It was a shock to the Danish people because Denmark was very close to being totally wiped out as a nation. So I think this experience, in a way, vaccinated the artists and the Danish culture. In a way, they were not able to paint, they were not able to deal with the concept of a national identity. It was very difficult to be proud of Denmark after 1864 because the National Liberal Party, who has ruled Denmark for several decades, were blamed for this unrealistic endeavor in 1864, because they persuaded the Danes and told the Danes that we are a big country, a big nation, a military power. Denmark had never been a military power, and at least we were not in 1864. So we were very well beaten. And this mentality of defeat has a great impact on how we see Danish national identity after 1864. Because what I think is quite interesting is that instead of a national identity, instead of pride in being Danish, there is a shift towards a more regional celebration, a regional romanticism in a way, that also I think was what Rita was talking about. And in Denmark we have the artist colonies, who are very important in the last decades. We have an artist colony in Skagen, we have an artist colony in the island of Fyn, and in both places the artists are working with what I call the celebration of the local culture, of the regional landscape and the features of the local landscape. And it's a quite important thing, I think. So instead of painting ideal paintings of the peasantry, in Skagen they paint the fishermen instead, the local fishermen, making them the heroes of more contemporary painting, I think. Michael Anker, I don't know if you know him, but he paints these paintings of fishermen as heroes, saving people from drowning, from sinking ships and all that. So he replaces the fishermen, or the peasantry, with the fishermen. And P.S. Krøyer paint these fantastic landscapes of Skagen, celebrating the nature around Skagen. And if you turn to Fyn, you will see that what is celebrated by the artists in Fyn is the rural culture. It's the farmer, once again, being put into perspective and celebrated as an ideal. And it comes, I think it's an important movement in Danish and Northern European culture at this time, this vitalistic movement where you are trying to replace the decadence of the big city, urbanism, with the celebration of man in nature, or the way of life represented by the farmer and the rural culture. So I think that the national identity in Denmark is still expressed and it's still being painted, but it's being put into the more celebration of regionalism in a way, I think. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. No, that's, I think, and that this regional is an international phenomenon, of course, and I think a part of the and just on the social classes, I'll just say that an interesting interpretation of this painting, I think it's still on the screen, is that it's not showing people from the peasant class, of course, but these sort of high bourgeois couple, and that they are looking at not an orderly garden or anything, but just a sort of ordinary nature and finding it very beautiful. And they are, as the sort of Marxist interpretation is, that they can look at this landscape and they own it. They own it not only because they bought it, which they had, because they made money in industries, but they also own it intellectually because they are the elite that understand to appreciate it. The old aristocracy and sort of haven't they're not read up. They haven't lived in France. They don't appreciate. They're not in. Whereas in this period, these painters were closely allied to sort of collectors who were sort of married to them. They were Jewish families sometimes not, and that they had appreciated this new kind of sort of Barry's idea of the atmosphere in the landscape. So I think that is also an aspect.
But in Norway, they have the same landscapes.
Well, no, in Norway they have mountains, and I think that's a point that we realized that we hadn't in this we were going to lose Norway, so don't go paint these Nordic mountains. And that was a criticism of Anna Boberg, that she was painting Norway, not Sweden. And of course, after 1905, that was considered not so patriotic. But also, of course, Norway has a sort of much more spectacular nature. So the idea was also, we have to go and we have to go and promote the not so spectacular nature of Sweden. Otherwise, we're going to sort of lose our identity here again. And talking about, so I think these political aspects that Rita, and also these military parallels fascinating in Nick's talk are important. Nick, you spoke mostly of Swedish and Norwegian and Danish artists in your talk. And what about the Finnish artists? Were they considered Russians or German or something else?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Finland has its own sort of, within the reception history of Nordic artists within French literature at the second half of the 19th century. Finland itself falls under, or if you will, maybe suffers within French criticism due to, again, geopolitical conflict. Russia is not present at the 1855 Universal Exposition because of the Crimean War. So they decide not to exhibit, and therefore the Duchy of Finland also either doesn't or is not allowed. It's a little bit peculiar what happens, but you don't see any Finnish artists in 1855 when other people like Tidemand, right, and Gouda were having such big success. Another big issue is that within the 1867 and 1878 exhibition catalogs, Finnish artists are all listed as Russians. So if people are sort of basing their understanding of art off of what they're reading in front of them, there was less of an ability to sort of acutely understand these artists as nationally Finnish, or them having a sort of national style of art. However, with the success of sort of Finnish artists during the 1880s, and then finally in 1889, that's when for the first time you have Finnish artists exhibiting separately. And that's, again, because of politics, because 1889 was the centenary of the French Revolution, and governments that were monarchies largely refused to exhibit, and so there were private enterprises that took over governmental organization. And so that's for the first time. You still see most of the nations exhibiting there, but they're actually under private enterprises. And the Duchy of Finland, organizers there decide to exhibit, although as Finns. And so it's during really the 1880s that you have this idea of Finnish art coming about within the French press. People start actually talking about Finnish art as being its own thing, yet at the same time it's still sort of beholden to Swedish art. They're not really, a lot of the French critics aren't really understanding some of the Finnish national romantic literature that has been developing during the 19th century. They're looking at it as a sort of offshoot, right, of Swedish art. It's a sort of subspecies of Swedish art, if you can think of it as taxonomies. And so that's how it comes into play. Finnish art is definitely part of the idea of Scandinavian art, largely during the National Romantic period, but it has its own sort of unique history, in large part due to, again, literature and due to politics. So that's that.
Of course, it was interesting to see these rather approximative classifications of the Scandinavian artists into schools. Do you know the context of that dictionary when it was written? Was it one of those? I got the feeling that it was something written in a haste and without really consulting sort of anything, but for an audience who perhaps knew even less. Or what do you think it was thought over?
Well, unfortunately, I have to say that I'm still trying to do research on Sera, where he comes about. Again, he's a Belgian artist, right? He's Wallonian, so he speaks French. It's a sort of book that you would have been able to read within France. However, this book is absolutely massive, right? And you can only imagine the sort of panic of having to try to classify every artist that you've come across, and then try to create it into some sort of taxonomy. And so, yeah, absolutely, there's a fair amount of ignorance going into it. But at the same time, I mean, at this time of racialization and creating of national identities and people trying to break things down, obviously these are sort of pseudosciences in themselves. So it's really not possible, right? So it's a very interesting dictionary, and there's several volumes of it, and CRA changes up kinds of classification that he says. By the 1880s, kind of interestingly, he just says all Nordic artists are German within the sort of idea of school. So he decides to just sort of do sort of a, let's not try to parse it up whether they're Swedish or French or German. Let's just say that they're all German. And so it's almost like he kind of gives up, really. So that's what I think. And so with Sera, not that much known about him. Haven't been able to find any sort of secondary literature about him. Interesting figure. But really, I think it's a massive volume, goes through many iterations, and just sort of demonstrates the sort of mess that comes about when you try to absolutely classify something according to a school.
Much of this later period is, of course, somehow reflecting international symbolism. In the Swedish case, it's perhaps not that obvious often. Barry experimented with some sort of real symbolist motives, like Death and the Maiden and so on. But in the Finnish, in the Kalevala paintings, you get sort of closer to symbolism in a way. But what is the sort of history of interpretation, Rita, of this? Is it often referred to as part of international symbolism, or do Finnish art historians want to sort of keep it on as a separate phenomenon?
Thank you. This is a very good question. I mean, putting it more widely, and talking about the interpretations of these artists and subjects in Finnish art history. So, of course, you can look at many angles, but at least two. And the other one is that of sort of the national interpretation. The other one is that of underlining the modern influence, or all this, like you were saying, especially Akseli Kallela's Kalevala paintings, being part of the international modern symbolist flux. So I think at this point where we are now, so it is self-evident that we, and hopefully also other art historians who look at them, see them in this international and also, we would say, modern context. But it is controversial in a way, because talking about this whole idea of the national project, so there are also other things than wars and politics, or together with this goes also the thing of those artists and the interpreters having had cultural power. Because, well, looking, for instance, from the gender point of view, so artists like Galen Kallela, they were granted, they created for themselves an identity of being, in a way, national heroes. It doesn't count out from our present perspective the thing that this kind of an artist also can be a modern artist of his or her time. But earlier there has been a division, so in a way it has the modern aspect, the international aspect has been a little counted out when you have wanted to see somebody as a specifically national, like Galen Kallela. So I don't know if I answered your question, but also the landscape that I showed last. So of course, when you look at them stylistically, you look at them, so it's very clear. You were talking about in the Swedish context also about synthetist stylistic influences. So it's very clear that these artists who had studied in France, they were very, very aware of what was going on. Like Pekka Halonen, whose winter scene, the very intimate one, was there in the last slide. He had studied in Paul Gauguin's studio. So it is self-evident that it's not so. It's not something that is not connected with the rest of the world. But yes, today, of course, we want to see all this as part of a whole. But of course, all this which is concerning the idea of Scandinavianism, then historically is another story, so to say. Because some artists wanted to identify with Scandinavian artists very strongly, and those very often, like Albert Edelfelt, who Nick was talking about a little bit earlier. He was a Swedish speaker, and he was sort of very much, I think, identifying with the way in which Martin was describing the idea of Swedish art too. But then the other way of looking at it was this sort of looking at something different, something which was then considered more originally Finnish. I don't know if I answered your question.
So at this point, does anyone? Yeah.
Do I need this? Thank you for a brilliant panel. I think you have addressed very different aspects of these questions of nationalism and gave a very interesting and diverse vision of it. I would still have one question that you probably have different visions, is to see these questions from the artist perspective and in terms of strategy, because it might have been quite difficult for them at one point to be in Germany or later in France and be part of the movements of the time which make them German or French and try to sell on the market or try to differentiate themselves on the market with different views that look different from the enormous amount of paintings that you could see in the salon, having this identity, and then coming back home, forgetting or trying to forget that they've been abroad and become national, totally Finnish, Swedish, Danish, and then this Scandinavian or Nordic identity on the top of it. Might have been a lot of tensions for them, how to address the different aspects with one life. So this is a question I have for all of you.
Okay, because I've thought about this question a bit, although I haven't gone through it completely. So one of the things that you certainly do see, because since I look at Nordic artists within France, obviously I'm interested in internationalism, and I've tried to sometimes trace who exhibits where, and then is it only France? And I certainly don't have the full sort of scale of knowledge of how many of these artists are exhibiting in Germany, but many of them do. So again, you'll have artists that are exhibiting between, say, a exhibition salon in Copenhagen or in Christiania or Oslo, and also going down into Paris and also going over to Berlin. And so I think there definitely is a sort of more practical side to being an artist at the time, which is that they tried to have their work seen quite widely. And so you see that with Norwegian artists like Fritz Taulo, who's largely accepted by the French art critics community, in part because he will reside in France for a while in Dieppe. And then other people like Adelstein Norman, right, who had trained within Germany, right, he mostly paints northern Norwegian landscapes, who exhibits with the Society of French Artists, the sort of mainstream salon, but is largely rejected as being too German, not French enough, things like that. So, in short, I think maybe some other people that are a little bit more familiar with these sorts of personal ideas of identity, right, can maybe speak on it. But certainly I think if you look at the exhibition histories of these artists, yeah, these seem to be very quite practically exhibiting around at many different major salons, whether it's in Vienna or Berlin or Paris or back within their own home countries. So I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on this.
No, it's a good question, and it's also a question of historiography in a way, because many of the Scandinavians who came to France, as Vibeke Röstorp has shown, actually remained because they thought, well, some remained because they married, I suppose, but some remained because they thought the market opportunities were favorable to a continued career in France. So, but they have not been sort of discussed much in Swedish artistry because they are sort of lost because they also for reasons of sort of methods of research. Some actually settled in the countryside and tried to survive on just painting local landscapes. Some of them were sort of idealists, and they were very poor. They didn't sell. They barely survived. They had to sort of have handouts from rich friends. And some of them, like Anders Zorn, he became very rich from his paintings, and he settled in the country where he painted the scenes, but they sold to collectors, and then as soon as he felt he needed more money, he just went and painted American presidents and magnates, and then he sort of came back. So all kinds of different answers. And the problem is when you write a sort of synthetic artistry, you need to exclude many of them.
Thank you for this very good question. Just to answer briefly, of course, yes, all this has been, we know that it has been difficult, very controversial for the individual artist, because we're talking about political expectations, expectations from authorities in, say, France, in the original country, like Finland. Then we're talking about individual persons, artists, who, in a way, in the world, which is the modern world, are, and you can very much look at them like that, and sort of a little bit out of the box of the national interpretation, as modern artists who have their questions of identity, their personal mental life, their relations with other people near them, far away. I mean, all this. I mean, you cannot say, I think, that, of course, so to say that the narrative of national art and national artist is a construction, of course. It is one possibility to look at it.
Thank you, and excuse me for my terrible English. So I had a question for Nicholas Parkinson. It was very, very interesting because it was very close to my personal research. And I'm working about the idea of Scandinavian art in the French criticism at the end of the 19th century. And you speak about the article of Clarity in 73 and Ponsonnel a few years later in 89. At the time of Ponsonnel, there was a lot of articles about Scandinavian art because of the World's Fair. But I believe Clarity during the year 73 was alone to think there is a Scandinavian art. Because I read in the Gazette des Beaux-Arts a few years later, in 78, there is no Scandinavian art, there is no art in Norway, no art in Sweden, and no art in Denmark. In the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, so the most important newspaper about art in France at this time.
So first off, thank you for that question. I'm very glad to hear that there's other people interested in these very unique topics about Scandinavian art and French art criticism. So in 1878, and in the 1870s, yes, absolutely. I would actually agree with you. You see within different journals, including the Gazette des Beaux-Arts, people that decry the sort of Nordic artists, right? I think in general, during the 1870s, it's a transition period. I think that there's still this sort of sentiment of xenophobia broadly within the French press, right? Arguably, France is still sort of figuring out whether it's going to be a real republic or whatever. They're figuring out what politics are going to be and what its approach to the world is going to be. And so it's during this time, really what I think is interesting about clarity is that it's one of the first iterations of this term. Not that it's suddenly definitive, there is a Scandinavian art and Jules Clarity has decided so, but rather it's just sort of in the contrast of the xenophobia that you see in Menard, but also in other people, because that definitely exists still in the 1870s, and I'm sure it exists on in other times too.
So at the times of Clarity,
yeah.
It's an Egyptian. He was alone, and when you say it was a contrast with the other.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would like to know, you don't find this idea at the same time in the other newspapers.
Do you still find the ideas of there being a Scandinavian art? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's a few examples, but rare. So before the 1870s, there's maybe one example of really a politician who reviews the Salon in 1861, and we can talk about this afterwards if you're interested in it. Yeah.
I agree with you. I wanted to know if I had forgot something, but I understand that I don't have forgot. We are agreeing. So.
Okay, so yeah, fantastic. All right, fantastic. Well, thank you for the question again.
Good. I think we need to wrap up. Just on a very final comment on this painting. I keep returning to it. Is that about France and the Nordic country? Is that Barry was a very slow painter, so there were long hours for the models who were friends, and the model for the person, the male figure, was actually Prince Eugène. And while they were modeling, Barry's wife read to them aloud from the reports in the French press about the Dreyfus affair. So they kept à jour. So thank you everyone for coming, and thank you very much to the panel, not at least, and for the questions.